3. My eyes opened as suddenly as a bubble popping on the water surface. It was still night. The only sound was insects. The lute playing as I drifted off to sleep was no more, and neither were the voices and footsteps of the soldier, or the hammering of blacksmiths' anvils. I shut my eyes, considering going back to sleep, but within a few seconds, I was fully awake. Abandoning my attempt to rest, I sat up. Across the tent, the fencer was fast asleep, her posture pristine. But I didn't see Kismel in the space between us, where she should have been. After my temporary partner had finished her bath, I had slipped in for my own, and was out of water by the count of 100. Fortunately, neither of us had grown pointy ears after using it. We moved over to the dining tent with the surprisingly friendly elf soldier, and dined lightly on baked bread, roast chicken, and vegetable soup and fruit. When we returned to Kismel's tent, I felt highly satisfied. We found the tent owner already curled up in the blankets and sleeping peacefully. The moment I saw that, all my fatigue from earlier came flooding back, and the two of us silently took our corners of the tent and laid down on the furs. I remember pulling a nearby blanket up to my chin, and nothing after that. My menu window said that it was 2 in the morning. No wonder I felt awake. I'd gotten a solid 7 hours of sleep. Taking care not to make any noise, I closed the window and slipped out of the blankets. When I passed through the hanging flap of the tent, the night lamps of the camp were mostly out, leaving the area lit by pale moonlight. A quick scan of the area showed no one moving, except 2 sentries marking the walls. So where could Kismel have gone? Perhaps onward the next quest on her own? I shook my head. An NPC wouldn't be that independent, and her HP bar listed next to Asuda's mine was still full. I thought it over, then decided to head to one part of the Dark Elf base I hadn't visited yet, behind the commander's tent, at the very back of the clearing. The moonlight in Aincrad was bright enough in any place open to the sky to make it easy to walk around. The moon itself was out of sight unless you were close to the outer perimeter, of course. So its light was reflecting off the tower side of the floor above. But just that gave the blue glow an even more earthly beauty. I headed east around the great command tent and stopped when the space behind it came into view. It was a tiny, grassy stretch with a single tree. I recalled it being an entirely empty dead space in the beta, but now there were 3 new objects beneath the long branches of the tree. 3 simple but beautiful grave markers carved of wood. The woman I'd been searching for was standing before the leftmost grave. She was in a tunic and tights now, not the underwear from earlier, but still without her signature armor. She was downcast, staring at the base of the grave. In the light of the moon, her smoky purple air was glowing like lilac. After a few seconds of hesitation, I slowly approached, stopping several feet away. The dark elf knight noticed my footsteps and looked up at me. "Kirito, the morrow will be difficult if you don't get your rest," she whispered. "I slept better than I usually do. Thanks for letting us use your tent." "I don't mind. It's too large for me alone," she responded, then looked back to the grave. I took 2 more steps and examined the marker. There were small words carved into its flesh, unfinished surface. I squinted and made out the name Tilnell. "Tilnell?" I said aloud, and noticed that it sounded very similar to the rhythm of Kismel. She paused and then said, "My sister. She lost her life in the first battle after we descended this floor last month." The phrase descended to this floor indicated that dark elves, and likely forest elves as well, understood that the floating castle of Aincrad was made out of numerous stacked floors. Not only that, they could use their magical charms to sidestep the system of the labyrinth stairs and town teleport gates. Perhaps their movement range was limited from this floor up to the 9th. I'd had this basic knowledge of the elves since the beta, when I completed the campaign quest for the first time, but I was so preoccupied of getting further into the game than anyone else at the time. It never occurred to me that the battle between the elves might tie into the game world itself. I was stuck by the sudden urge to ask Kismel how Aincrad came to be, but I held it with the breath of cool night air. It wasn't fair to ask so much an important question while Asuna was absent, and this wasn't the time to ask anyway. Instead, I asked about Kismel's late sister. Was Tilnell a knight too? No, my sister was a herbalist. Her job on the battlefield was to tend the wounded. She never carried anything larger than a dagger. She was at the rear guard when the forest elves' falconers ambushed us from behind. I grimaced and held my breath. The forest elven falconers were the worst mob on the 3rd floor after the bosses and event enemies. The dark elves had their own dark elven wolf handlers, but the falconers were big danger, given that they could attack you from the ground and air simultaneously. However, she chose to interpret my silence. Kismel tense profile eased somewhat. I have no chairs or blankets, but you ought to sit. There's no need to stand around here. Sure. I sat down next to her. The thick, soft grass in its tiny graveyard supported my weight with ease. The knight picked up a leather skin sitting next to her, pulled out the plug, and took a swig, then passed it to me. I thanked her, and accepting the drink, temporarily forgetting that I was interacting with an NPC rather than another person. When I put my lips to the skin, a thick liquid flooded between them. It was slightly sweet and sour, and when I finished it, there was a burning like alcohol in the back of my throat that felt fresh and cool. I handed back the skin. Kismel held it over the grave and poured the rest of the liquor onto Tilnell's grave marker. This was her favorite. Moontear wine made of moontear herbs. I snuck some out of the castle, hoping to bring it to her. In the end, she never had a sip. The empty skin slipped from her hands and plopped lightly on the grass. Kismel crouched, lining her knees together and hugging them tight. I accepted the mission to retrieve the Jade Key yesterday. I was prepared to die. Part of me might have hoped for it. At best, I might have taken that forest elf down with me. Otherwise, I would simply have lost. But fate helped you guide me away from my death. And after I'd sworn no gods existed in this forsaken place anymore. Kismel glanced over at me. I noticed that her onyx eyes were moist, and I was at a loss for how to react. Kismel and her sister, Tilnell, were residents of this world, risking their lives for the sake of their people. And I was nothing but a temporary visitor, an outsider. But in truth, that was not the case anymore. Asa and I were trapped in this game now, just like Kismel. We had only one life to give, and yet, when we inserted ourselves into the fight between her and the forest elf knight, I'd foolishly rested on my laurels, convinced that once we were at half health, the dark elf would sacrifice herself to let us win. It had been wrong of me to draw my sword with that in mind, set. Whether I knew that would happen or not, I should have fought with all my ability to protect my own life and the lives of Asuna and Kismel. Biting back the sudden regret, I said, it wasn't the gods. Asa and I were there on our own will. We'll stick with you to the end. until you get back home. The dark elf knight grinned. In that case, I will do my best to protect you until our paths part. Thursday, December 15th, 2022. Kismil, the level 15 dark elf knight, Kirito, the level 14 swordsman, and Asuna, the level 12 fencer and temporary party member, left the base camp for a new adventure. The night had not yet broken. It was 3 in the morning, and the trees of the forest were quietly slumbering in the pale moonlight. When Kismil and I returned from our graveyard vigil, we found Asuna, not sleeping, but fully packed and ready to leave. When the fencer saw me without my weapon and armor on, she looked annoyed and wondered why I'd left and not get prepared for the trip. When I followed her into the tent by Kismil in her thin underclothes, Asuna's glare turned downright icy. My only choice was to claim that I had been ready for hours. Asuna continually threw me skeptical glares as we walked through the camp clearing, but only until we passed through the narrow canyon out into the forest of wavering mists again. The sight was even more fantastical now. The mossy trees and low, thick mists were lit by pale moonlight. I'd seen the exact same thing months before, but I couldn't help but gasp at its beauty. Asuna was completely bowled over. She murmured, "It's stunning," and I didn't move for another 30 seconds. Kismil silently waited along with me, though it was hardly the first time I'd been surprised by her behavior. It would be perfectly ordinary behavior for an NPC for players to react, but it seemed to me that she was choosing to take her time and respect Asuna's feelings of wonder. When my partner came to her senses again, the knight spoke softly. She loved the night forest as well. Come, let us be off. The quest given to us by the commander after completing the Jade Key was titled Vanquishing the Spiders. The forest was exploding with poisonous spider monsters who were sabotaging patrol missions, so it was our job to find the nest. I'd done this quest before, of course, but the location of the nest was generated randomly, so my memory was to no use here. We just had to trek through the forest, fighting spiders until narrowed down the source. The poison would be at a constant threat of this quest. Damage-causing poison was the most common status effect of our many negative effects in SAO. Level 1, weak poison, and Level 2, light poison, weren't such a big deal, as long as you were prepared to deal with them. I made sure to check with Asuna as we hiked through the forest. How many antidote potions do you have? She brought up her window with a jingle. 3 in my pouch, 16 in my inventory. About the same as me. That'll be enough. Something struck out to me. Unlike healing crystals, potions couldn't be used on other people. So if Kismil got affected with poison, she'd need to use her own potion to recover. I turned back to the elf who was bringing up the rear. Kismil, do you have any antidote potions? I do have a few, just in case, but I don't need them. I have this, she remarked with what I thought might be a hint of pride, showing off her right hand in a tight leather glove. There was a ring shoved directly over the glove on her index finger. The gemstone gleamed brightly, despite the dim light, green, just like the antidote potion. What kind of ring is that? I received it along with my sword from Her Majesty when I was knighted. It allows me to use Purifying Charm once every 10 minutes. Wowzers! I barely kept the word from busting out of me. In all of my time in the game, I had never seen or heard of an accessory that allowed an unlimited poison curing, or even with a cooldown timer. It actually worked on level 5 lethal poison. This was an elite item of the highest quality. Kismil coughed awkwardly, sensing the desire written plain on my face. I cannot give it to you, as much as you might like it. For one thing, this ring draws upon what little magic is left in the blood of Lysula, so you humans would not be able to use it, I suspect. You suspect? I nearly asked, but held back. Why do you say that? I don't want your ring at all. I'm just checking to ensure that you're equipped to deal with the poison, I said breezily, denying any greed on my part. Asuna grinned. That's right. You're a boy, so you'd never stoop demanding a ring from a girl. Of course. Wait, are you saying the reverse would be possible? I grumbled. Asuna's smile disappeared. I wasn't saying that. When did I ever beg you for a ring? I wasn't referencing you specifically. We stopped walking and glared daggers at each other. The elf knight looked on, concerned. Kirito, Asuna, I hate to cut your chit-chat. Something is approaching. Based on the footsteps, it's neither elf, nor human, nor beast. There are two of them. From the front and the right. I will leave the one ahead to you. Asuna and I stopped glaring at each other and looked in the direction of our travel. A shadow was flitting at high speed through the trees. It only came up to our waist, but it was very wide. Many thin legs skittered and scuttled, gliding it along the ground. Within a second, the cursor popped into view, part way between pink and red. The name beneath the HP bar was Thicket Spider. Prepare for battle, Asuna, I called, drawing my sword and bracing myself for the fight. Asuna already had her wind fleuret in hand. This quest was an opportunity to gather a few more materials to forge herself a new sword back at camp, meaning it was the last time to shine for the battle partner she'd fought with since the first floor. Its only direct attack is a bite, but watch out for the thread it shoots from its ass. It'll slow you down. Understood, she shouted back, and then briefly shot me a dirty look. I wondered what she was mad about this time. Then I realized my poor choice of words. Sorry, I shouldn't have said ass. It's not an ass, but more of a, just stop saying that word. Asuna neatly sidestepped the poisonous spider's fangs that came lunging at us, then thrust a furious linear into the giant eye. The venomous fangs and sticky thread were not to be trifled with. But the thicket spider was one of the easiest insect-type monsters until this point. It didn't fly or run away, and its hide was not protected by a hard shell. All of its attacks were simple and direct, so it was easy to time when to switch players for combos. Asuna knocked down about 40% of the spider's HP with a sword skill and regular attack, then stepped back and glanced at me. I noticed her eye contact, and preparing to join the fight. If this was in the open air rather than the forest, Asuna could have handled the spiders all on her own. But the thread the spider shot from its rear would last for close to a minute, which gradually decreased the available space for the fight as the battle wore on. It was always possible to move to a fresh location without the webs, but there was the risk that you'd snag more mobs on the way. Not to mention, the tree ants looked like withered old trees. The thicket spider charged forward with very spidery hiss. At least, as far as video game spiders went, Asuna released an oblique, a low thrust skill. Its range was lower than a linear, but with the user's weight behind it, the power was higher. Her sword hit the spider's large gaping fangs, and both of them were knocked back with flashy visual effect. Switch! I yelled, striking the large spider in its soft butt. It was only a normal swing, but I hit right into the weak point of its thread-producing end, and it wheeled around with a painful screech. The cluster of eyes along the front of its head glared at me, poisonous jaw furiously working. The thicket spider was one of the smallest spiders of its type, but it made for a menacing sight. Several feet across from leg to leg, anyone afraid of spiders would suffer tremendous mental debuff, if I had to guess. I was used to spiders of all sizes from the shrine grounds near my childhood home. I'd even got stuck face first into a cobweb of yellow spiders once, so it wasn't a big deal to affect me in combat. But it was surprising how well the urbane, fastidious Asuna was handling the giant arachnid. I got so wrapped up in wonder that the last bit I had glanced away and met her waiting gaze for just a second. As though waiting for this moment, the spider struck. The 8 gray, hairy legs tensed and bounded into the air. If its jumping attack succeeded in causing a tumble status, I'd end up bitten several times by its poisonous fangs. So avoidance was top priority. Due to my late reaction, I knew I couldn't step aside and counterattack with a heavy sword skill in time. So I fell onto my back, waited a split second, and then kicked with all my might. The toe of my boot glowed red and swung in a semicircle through the air. Crescent Moon, a martial arts kicking skill. It was meant to be used for a standing position into a back flip, but as long as the motion was correct, you could pull it off while lying down. The skill was convenient to throw while lying on a back, but there were serious drawbacks. If I miss, I would be hit with both tumble status and a movement delay. Fortunately, it was worth the frightening gamble, as my foot stuck airborne spider directly at the base of one of its legs. With a satisfying thud, the spider shot away, spinning through the air. The follow-through of the kick flipped me back onto my feet. I turned to go see the spiders upside down at the base of the nearby tree, its legs scrambling against the air. Non-winged insect enemies were generally slow to recover from a tumble, so I calmly and carefully held my anneal blade at my waist height. The dark blade took a brilliant blue glow, and the body shot forward. Ugh! I leapt, sword flashing. The blade swung horizontally from left to right, directly across the thicket spider's bulging belly. As soon as it had passed, my wrists flipped over and reversed the path from right to left to complete the horizontal arc. A flat 2-part skill. Its weak spot hit deep from 2 directions. The poison spiders flew through the air, spewing green liquid, and landed upside down, legs curled inward this time. Its large body exploded into countless fragments. The attack left me leaning forward, sword held out to the left ahead of me. I slowed and stood up straight, swishing the blade left to right before returning it to the sheath on my back. When I turned around, Asuna was staring at me, so I instinctively raised my hand for a high five. She was not expecting that reaction in the slightest, and looked awkward for a moment, but was kind enough to not leave me hanging. After the high five, she wasted no time in getting after me. "You were distracted during the battle, weren't you?" Yes, ma'am." "What were you thinking about?" I stopped to consider my answer under her withering gaze, then recalled I was surprised at how well she handled the giant spider. However, whether to mention that out loud was another quandary. "Sloppiness against even weak foes will lead to disaster, Kirito," came a voice from my right. Kismel was standing to the side, arms crossed, having dispatched the other thicket spider well before Asuna and I finished. Like Asuna, her face was hard. It felt like I was being scolded by both of my classmate and a teacher at once. I had to make an excuse for myself. I wasn't being sloppy. I was just thinking. "And what were you thinking about?" Nothing convenient came to mind, so I had no choice but to say the truth. Bear. I was just thinking that it's surprising you don't have any issues with the spiders and wasps and such. Huh? Were you really wasting your time thinking about that nonsense? Yes, I admitted. Her shapely eyebrows went wide with displeasure for a moment. Then she sighed. Once they're that big, the bugs are no different from wild animals. I can't waste my time being afraid of how monsters look. Ah, I see. She shook her head in exasperation, and Kismil chuckled softly. I turned to the dark elf in surprise and saw her looking down at the short-faced fencer with warmth in her eyes. This is very reassuring. My sister Tilnell did not shy away from corporeal monsters, either, whether insects or oozes. She finished at no more than a whisper. Asuna and I both looked away politely. Asuna hadn't seen Tilnell's grave, but I'd secretly told her about Kinnell's sister as we trudged through the forest. When she noticed our expressions, Kismel apologized for bringing that up, then raised her hand to change the topic. What is the meaning of that gesture you just did? She asked, waving her hand forward. I thought this over. Was it right to explain to Kismel, an NPC of the world of SAO, the significance of a real-world high-five? Before I could come to a conclusion, Asuna spoke up. It's a human gesture, meant to congratulate one another for their effort. She held up her own hand and slapped Kismel's much more thoroughly than she had bothered with me, producing a satisfying smack. Kismel looked down at her palm and squeezed it, as though savoring the sensation. I see. We elves do not make a practice to touch others often, but this is not unwelcome. She held up her hand again, and looked at me this time. I gave her a hearty high five, realizing it would just be awkward to hold it back now. There was another crisp smack, and an instant warmth in my hand. A memory flooded back into my brain. It was the very first day of this game of death. It felt like ancient history at this point, but in fact, it was before everything turned deadly. I was thinking of the afternoon of Sunday, November 6th, 39 days before, when my very first friend in Einkrad, Klein, lazily hunted blue boars with me outside the town of beginnings on the first floor. Klein was struggling with the initiations of sword skill, so I taught him the basics of the first motion. Then slapped him a high five when he succeeded in killing his first boar. That was the last time I ever contacted him. As soon as Akihiro Kayaba's cruel tutorial on the new rules of the game finished, I headed for the next village as soon as I could. I left Klein, a helpless newbie, back in the town of beginnings. I abandoned him. Kirito. What is the matter, Kirito? I came back to my senses with a start. My hand was still hanging up in the air, so I lowered it and said, nothing. My awkward smile did nothing to remove the concerned looks, but Kismel soon moved on. I see. Let's get going. If we follow that direction from which the spiders appeared, we should find the nest eventually. Cool. So that means we're heading, this way, said Asuna, exasperately. Pointing out the northwest, we set off again. After about 30 steps, Asuna pulled level with me to whisper in my ear. Hey, did Kesmel just say something about corporeal monsters? Yeah. Which means there are monsters in this game without bodies? Huh? Yeah, like ghosts and stuff? I asked in return. She blanched briefly of the word ghosts. Like that? I don't know. I didn't see any in the beta. Besides, I don't know how you defeat a monster without a body in a game where you can only use swords. Let's hope so. I wasn't sure what she was hoping for, but Asuna did not bother to elaborate. She slowed her pace to draw even with Kismel. I continued my march in the direction of the spider nest. After another 4 battles with thicket spiders and their larger cousins, Copsy spiders, slightly adjusting our direction after each encounter, eventually spotted a small hill raising ahead. Highlighted against the side of the moonlit hill was a gaping black mouth of a cave. I crouched in the shadow of the trees and saw about 14 small spiders, still the size of real tarantulas, darting around the entrance. This was the spider nest we were after. Do we have to get rid of those little ones too? Asked Asuna. Looking at the nest in annoyance, I shrugged. No, those are just critters. What? Do they jingle? I turned upward to look at her in confusion. She spoke with a bossy tone of a teacher explaining to her student. Didn't you just say it was a clitter? Like clitter clatter? Do they make a lot of noise? No. Critters in an MMO are like background animals that aren't monsters. You can't interact with them. They're just for show, like butterflies or alley cats in town. You know what? I'm getting tired of asking about every single game turn. So why don't they just create a slang glossary for me? Ugh. If she didn't mind being ripped off, she could go ask Argo for something like that. Kismel chuckled from behind us and murmured, Your words have not been unified yet, it seems. I suppose that's not a surprise. There were 9 nations of humankind when the Great Separation happened. Asa and I shared a look. The separation was a term many used to refer to an incident that arose 1 month before. Many players suffered disconnections and were stuck in a limbo for an hour before they rejoined the game. When it became clear that every player was going to be disconnected in such a way, I stopped my breakneck leveling for a bit and waited around in an inn in a room so that it didn't catch me off guard. The mysterious phenomenon caused alarm and chaos at first, but the common assumption that emerged was that it was just our bodies being temporarily disconnected so they could be transferred to a proper hospital. But this great separation Kismel spoke of must be something else. She was a resident of this world, not just a player diving from Nurvgir like me and Asuna. It must have something to do with the creation of Einkrad, the floating castle. I instantly had a number of different questions to ask Kismel on the subject, but she cut me off before I could open my mouth. Come, let us investigate the whole. I will need more concrete information to bring the commander about the spiders. According to my increasingly unhelpful beta knowledge, the spider vanquishing quest had 2 stages. Part 1 involved finding an article from one dark elf scouts within the nest and bringing back it to the base. In the second part, we had to return to the cave and fight the queen spider in the 2nd level of the nest. So, even though I knew this opening led right into Spider's nest, that alone did not fill the quest requirements. We'd have to delve into the clammy cave twice. I don't like these natural dungeons, Asuna grumbled, stepping into a shallow puddle with her leather boots. I nodded in agreement. If only it was a bit brighter in there. A man-made dungeon like giant labyrinth towers at least had oil lamps or luminescent stones on the walls to keep the interior lit, but this cave was almost pitch black. The only source of light was very dim moss that gave off a faint glow in the dark. To counteract the darkness, Asa and I carried torches in our hands, but they did not cast very much light and would extinguish if dropped into water. Even worse, I normally fought with one hand free, so the difference made everything feel wrong in battle. Still, It was better than being a shield user who had to do without a valuable defense. And warriors with two-handed weapons would slap us for being spoiled. They would find a dry spot on the ground and drop the torch before they could fight at all. Thankfully, in this situation, we had Kismel with her special elven ability to see in the dark. Unlike the jumping spiders out in the forest, the ones in the nest were speedy, fishy spiders. And Kismel's ability to warn us of their presence before they reached the torchlight radius gave us plenty of time to ready our blades. We searched each room of the first level of the cave slowly but steadily, occasionally finding chests with treasure or valuable ores that could be used to craft Asana's next weapon. Once we had nearly finished mapping out the entire floor, Asana raised a belated question. Hey, is this dungeon one of those instance things? Or is it... I believe the antonym for an instant dungeon would be a public dungeon. This is the public kind, I murmured quietly into Asana's ear, afraid if Kismel heard she would give us another lecture about fractured language of humankind. The reason I know it's public is because there are other quests that use this dungeon aside from ours. Oh? Like what? Well, there's a pet finding quest in the next village past the chorus, and another one in the main city of the... My mouth shut with a snap. Asana's orange-lit face looked at me curiously. I tore away, looked behind us. The way we'd come was almost complete darkness, without a soul in sight. But did I hear something? A faint, brief scrape of metal? Hey, what's wrong? How many hours have we been on the third floor, Asana? After all the sleep we got, I think around 14 hours. Aw, crap. That's the exact timing. Exact timing of what? I turned, looked back again, whispered quickly. This is the location of a major quest that you can start in the main city. There are a few different patterns of the quest, so it's not guaranteed, but a solid percentage of the players doing that quest are going to be coming here for an item. Depending on the size of the party, it might take between 10 to 15 hours for them to get this far. But then, I heard another faint clang of metal. Kismel stopped dead, a sign that it wasn't just a trick of my ears. She watched us and waited for a tense moment, face sharp, and then turned to us. Kirito and Asana, it would seem there are other visitors to this nest. Yeah, it must be another human warriors. We have reasons to avoid them and encountering them, Kismel. I do as well. The elf knight grinned, pointed a divot into the wall. Let us hide here for a moment. Huh? How could we hide with the light of the torches and all? Asana asked, wide-eyed. Kismel smiled again. The people of the forest have their own ways of deception. She pushed our backs, guiding us to the 3-foot deep depression in the wall, and up again to the surface, then pressing herself against to hide us from view. Her ample bosom, tight stomach, and smooth thighs were pressed directly against me. And I was afraid the game's anti-harassment code would go off. But apparently, that did not apply when it was an NPC initiating the contact. Kismel, of course, had no idea what was running through my mind. Extinguish the torches, she commanded. I did as she said and dropped the light into a puddle on the floor. Once we were shrouded in darkness, Kismel stretched out a cape and covered all 3 of us. Oddly enough, while the cape seemed to be woven from solid from the outside, it was sheer and see-through from the inside. All I could see was blackness, of course, but there was enough green glow from the moss across the way to tell that the cape wouldn't block my sight. That wasn't the only surprise to me. Despite not using the hiding skill, its familiar hide rate percentage readout appeared on my left side of my view. Even more shocking, the number was 95%. Kismel's cape had a magic charm effect that had activated the hiding skill. Between this and the antidote ring, I was getting very jealous. You were saying earlier, Kirito? Asuna asked at the lowest possible volume, interrupting my fit of envy. It took me a moment to remember what we'd been talking about. Oh, right. The people coming up from behind us are on that quest. It's a guild creation quest. The one other frontier players were desperate to get started. Her eyes went wide. In the darkness, she remembered I was going to continue, but Kismel gave us a warning first. Quiet. They'll pass by soon. Asa and I shut our mouths and swallowed hard. 10 seconds later, we heard the rattling of armor on the move and counted at least 2 heavily armored fighters, if not 3. There were more footsteps, however. The party had 5 or 6 total. Finally, there came a rough shout, shockingly loud and careless in the midst of a dungeon.
What the hell? All the chests have been ransacked already!
It was a familiar voice, one that felt like I'd heard just minutes ago. I had seen him a whole 15 hours ago, but something about the circumstances, the fact that I hadn't even been to the town yet, or that his booming voice was so memorable to make you think, not again. Asuna's pale face grimaced in the darkness. We held our breath for several seconds. The first players passed by us so close we could reach out and touch them. He wore thick scale armor with a chain coif covered his entire head. It was too dark to make out the color of his tunic and pants, but they wouldn't be moss green. Without a doubt, in his hands, they'd be rounded shield, rare one-handed axe. It was a crude weapon for the front line, but he nimbly spun it around his fingers. The next man to pass by also with a shield and his sword, and the third was unhelmeted. But instead, his hair was fashioned into spikes that made his head look like a pointed mace. His eyes were sharp. His mouth was twisted in displeasure. He wore a steel breastplate and held a sword in one hand. This man's name was Kabao, and I had been running afoul with him since the boss fight on the first floor. As an avowed opponent to the former beta testers, he had plenty of reasons to hate me, and if he saw me in a dungeon, he'd no doubt have a foul word or 2 or 3 or 4 to say to me. The instant he passed by Kabao's deadly eyes and glanced at the hollow we were hiding in, and the hiding percentage dropped to 90. Fortunately, it did not drop enough to reveal us. 3 more players followed past him, their raucous clanking and growling fainter and fainter until they finally died out. A few seconds later, Kismel straightened up and returned her cape to its normal position. We heaved sighs of relief as we got to our feet. My partner looked worried. I felt more nervous than when we were facing monsters. Yeah, it probably would have turned us into a battle if they'd seen us, though. I answered. Asuna's head waved. Not quite a nod or a shake. Well, if they might have demanded that we share what we found in the chests, I don't know. I don't think they would go that far, I hope. Kismel turned away from the direction the party had gone and asked, Did you know some of those people? Kind of. We're not exactly on friendly terms, you might say.
Oh? I'd heard that humans in this castle had maintained a healthy peace for years. We wouldn't come to blows, of course, and help each other out when fighting big monsters, but we're not friends. There was no way to explain the difference between the former beta testers and retail players to Kismel, so my explanation had to be simple, but she seemed to buy the story. She grinned weakly and said, I see, that it must be like the relationship between my Pagoda Knights and Brigade and the Royal Scandolawood Knights. What does she mean, Pagoda? I wondered. Asuna chatted in delight. Oh, that's lovely. Your night brigades are named after trees? Are there any others? There are the Trilotate Night Brigade, the heavy units. We are not on good terms with them either. Ah, in that case, if I get to join any of them, I'll go with the Pagoda Knights. Kismel grimaced awkwardly. I'm afraid there is no historical precedence for a human being awarded a knight's sword from the Queen Lysula, but based on your accomplishments, you might be able to win an audience with her. Really? Let's keep it up then, Asuna beamed, nothing but optimism on her mind. I, however, had extra knowledge that caused me to avoid her gaze. In the beta, I'd followed this quest all the way up to the Dark Elf Castle on the 9th floor. But that was as far as I got. When the quest concluded, the gate to the castle remained steadfastly closed. Well, let's get going, Asuna bubbled, already an apprentice knight on her own mind, and slapped my back. After I gave her a solid affirmation and picked up torches off the ground by handing one to her, dropping the torches in the water didn't take effect to their ability to light again, as long as they had durability points left. We scraped them against the stone walls to get the flames started again, peered out of the hollow, and trained our ears on the direction of the party of 6 had gone. If Cabal's team was attempting the quest to establish their guild, they were headed for the 2nd level of the cave. We'd already cleared out all the spiders on the 1st level, so they could be by the stairs by now. The mobs down below would be tougher, but not enough to threaten the party of 6. I brought up my window and checked the map. We charted 4/5 of the level, with only 2 spots left. One was probably the room with the stairs down, and the other was the room with the item we sought. We needed to head for the room away from the direction of Cabal was moving. Let's go this way, I started to say, then caught Kismel staring at me. I wondered why. She was confused by the menu screen, or simply pretending not to see it? It has been a long time since I've seen a human charm. Huh? Charm? Indeed, it is the mystic scribing. One of the few charms left to humankind after the magic was lost, is it not? The one that allows you to record knowledge, even physical items within your mystic tome. Now that she mentioned it, it was a glowing purple screen that floated in midair at the wave of my hand. It was pretty much magic. No 2 ways around it. I nodded in agreement. Yes, that's it. According to the map in the Mystic Scribbly book, we checked and we haven't done this area yet. Behind Kismel, Asuna tried to hold back a belly laugh at my pathetic answer. We easily cleared out the spiders in one of the 2 remaining rooms, discovering a faint light blinking on in the back wall. I sheathed my sword and approached to find a silver decoration carved into a leaf. At the base was a gleaming white gem, like an opal. I looked up and checked the fastener of Kismel's cape on her left shoulder. The design and coloring were the exact same. It is the insignia of the Pagoda Knights. It belonged to a scout who had been investigating the cave. The owner cannot be alive anymore. Kismel remarked gloomily. I offered her the brooch, but she waved her head. You must take that to the commander, Kirito. We ought to return it for our report. All right, I'll hold on to it then. I put the emblem in my pouch. A message scrolled by on the left side of my view announcing the quest progress. When I found this scout's memento during the beta after a long, hard slog, the entire party cheered in triumphantly. But I was no longer in the mood at this time. It occurred to me that the moment we rescued Kismel's forest half a day ago, my mental concepts of quests and NPCs were steadily shifting. Mobs respawned at much higher rates in dungeons, so the spiders around the entrance were going to be back by now. I trained my ears to the sound of many legs, torch in one hand and sword in the other. But in a few seconds, what I heard was not the skittering of monsters, but the sound of men. Crap! It's coming up the stairs! Run! Run! Back to the entrance! There was crashing of metal on armor, panicked footsteps, and then the screeching of a very large monster, like dead wood creaking and cracking. "No one said anything about a freaking huge spider! What the hell's going on?" Cabal bellowed. The irritation in his voice from earlier had been amplified into panic. I turned to my companion to confer. What should we do, Kirito? I will leave this decision in your hands." I never volunteered to be in the party leader. I wailed internally, but it was too late for that. Now it was up to me to decide how to respond to this unexpected turn of events. Ideally, we would hide. Cabal's group would succeed in escaping, and the giant spider would return to the second level of the cave once it lost its target. But the likelihood of all these things happening was low. The nimble fishing spiders would have reopened the entrance by now, so Cabal's party wasn't likely to get out of the forest safely. In the worst case scenario, they might wind up trapped on both sides. The freaking huge spider had to be the queen spider, boss of the dungeon. So that would be a terrible situation. The next best choice was Cabal's group to stop running and face the queen. From what I recalled, it wouldn't be too hard for a party of 6 around level 10 to defeat the spider without casualties. But that was the assumption all of them were calm and dealt with her special attacks properly. Cabal's Einkrad Liberation Squad were steadfast in their denial of all beta testers, so none of them would have advanced knowledge of the unfamiliar monster. That thought process took me 2 seconds. I spent another half second looking over Kismel's tense face. Whether we got along, Cabal or not, his party was an invaluable force in reaching our shared goal. We couldn't ignore their plight, but I was also hesitant to butt in directly. There was no way to know about how they, particularly Cabal, would react when the battle was over and noticed Kismel. They might not attack directly, but I felt a strong aversion to letting them see her. Lately, I've been trying hard not to let the terms NPC or game be spoken in her presence. Well, let's pass by and stop the spider as it chases. If we can get it into a big room over there, we should have enough space to fight, I said quickly. Asuna and Kismel both stared at me. There were a difference of thought behind their hazel brown and onyx black pair of eyes. But both women nodded in agreement, before I needed to spend valuable seconds trying to figure out what they were. All right, you lead the way. If you have decided to fight, I will follow. Kismel was the one thing, but Asuna's agreement took me a bit by surprise. There was no time to waste by asking why. However, I had to consult my mental map of the dungeon and estimate Cabal's route. This way! I waved my torch and started running after the sound of the footsteps. Within just 10 steps, the corridor intersected a wide cross path. Cabal's group should come down that path from the left to right, the Spider Queen on their heels. Once the players had passed, we'd grab her attention and pull her back into the room where the scout's memento had been. The party would continue running all the way to the entrance, perhaps running across the minor spiders near the entrance, but otherwise convinced they'd outrun the queen. We leaned back into another hollow in the wall. Asuna's torch was still lit, but mine extinguished. I waited in thicker darkness, timing when to charge. The ideal method of fishing mob was through the taunt skill or throwing knives, but I didn't have any at my disposal at the moment. So, my only option was to swing my sword into the intersection to catch the queen as she passed by. And because I need to back away immediately, I couldn't use a sword skill with a movement delay after it. I gripped my anneal blade and heard the shouts of the group again. It's an intersection. Which way's the exit? We just went through here. Straight, straight, straight. 6 pairs of clanking footsteps approached. I flattened my back against the wall, watching the intersection with laser focus 5 yards away. 2 seconds later, a gang of men raced across my field of vision. The man led the way was still casually twirling his axe, but the others looked desperate. When running from a dungeon foe, the lightly armored types would always break away from the slower, heavier kind, but Cabal's leadership kept his team tightly packed. Once the party had rushed past, I heard a roar like scraping sticks again. I couldn't hear the sound of the thin legs, but the unique vibration of many spider legs hitting the ground traveled through my boots. 3 seconds left. 2. Now! I leapt forward, silently, my kneel blade raised for a compact swing. I wasn't looking for huge damage, but I needed to generate enough hate to make the spider change targets. The moment I started my swing, a giant form crossed the left side of my vision. First there was a round, glowing red eyes, then legs the size of tree trunks, and last a bulging body. With a silent scream, I struck the giant spider's flank. It was nothing more than a slightly charged normal swing, but it was enough to point to pierce the dull purple exoskeleton and send the green liquid shooting out. The spider bellowed in rage and stopped still as I pulled the sword out. I leapt back and raced for Austin and Kismel, not to bother to check if the spider was following. When I looked over my shoulder, the queen spider had just finished a 90-degree turn. My gaze met her many glowing eyes, and I noticed that her first of her 2 HP bars was slightly decreased. The name listed was Nephilia Regina. I knew that the name Regina was Latin for queen, which made her Queen Nephilia. In that light, the silver pattern on her gleaming purple body did lend a regal air. "Looks like you got her attention," Asuna whispered, peeling away from the wall. The 8-legged queen crouched down, eyes flashing dangerously, as though displeased with the light of Asuna's torch. It screeched and raced forward, but we weren't just standing and watching. As soon as the first leg twitched forward, all 3 of us were off running. The 3 narrow quarters were no place to fight a foe, with movement speed disabling attacks. After 10 seconds of running, the opening to a large empty room appeared to our right. We darted inside. The 2 women spread out around me in the center. I scraped the torch in my left hand on the floor and to light it again. And just as the queen barreled into the room, I charged directly for me without hesitation. I stood and watched the 2 front legs as they rose high into the air. As long as nothing had changed from the beta, the queen spider used the following attacks: jab from the front legs, bites from poison fangs, a sticky spray from the rear, and a vertical jump that landed with a shockwave. The webbing attack would stick a player to the place if stuck to the feet, and if it touched your head, there is no way to swing your weapon. The shockwave was similar in nature to the one used by the Minotaur bosses on the 2nd floor. If you lose your footing, you're either stumbled or fall over. Without the time to tell Austin and Kismel about these attacks beforehand, I just have the instinct to tell them in real life. Watching the spider's legs closely, I shouted, "When she jabs with her legs, the one that twitches will go first. If you don't get out of sight of her range, both will hit you." Just as the words were out of my mouth, the right front leg twitched. I jumped to the left. A giant claw slammed into the spot where I'd just been standing, and the left leg swung forward a moment later, but couldn't follow me because the first leg was in the way. The instant I, too, stuck into the ground, I shouted a command. "One sword skill!" Uncowled by the unfamiliar boss monster before both of them, both women immediately brandished their weapon, blades glowing. I noticed the glow out of the corners of my eye, stuck by the spider's legs with a horizontal. The beast was hit by light and a sound of a triplicate. Screeching hideous as third of the top of its HP bar fell away. It had to be Kismel's power that made that kind of damage possible. At this pace, as long as we played it safe and limited ourselves to single skills, we could finish Nephilia off in another 6 or 7 rounds. I didn't take any chances, watching the spider closely. After the delay wore off and it started moving again. She was only the queen over a simple 2-level dungeon, but she was a boss monster in her own right. I wasn't going to relax and assume that she hadn't been altered since the beta, the same way the floor bosses were. The queen took a few skittering steps and crunched down with all legs. "She's gonna jump! We have to leap out of the way just before she lands. I'll tell you when. The huge spider leapt upward, shaking the very air of the chamber. Once it reached the ceiling and began to fall, I cried out, 2, 1, jump! We leaped high as the queen spider fell, the shockwave effect passing harmlessly beneath our feet. Just before I had landed, I prepared another sword skill. In the midst of all the precise judgment and careful observation, I'd completely forgotten that the powerful, trusty elven knight was not a human being, but a programmed NPC. It shouldn't be possible. An NPC didn't respond to abbreviated commands from a player like this over their programmed algorithms. But nothing about her actions struck me as out of the ordinary. Gauging the length of the battle was extremely hard in VR MMO, where all sense of intense is occupied. It was typical for finishing up a fight and say, that was only a minute long? It took us an entire hour. So when Nephilia Regina, the Spider Queen, exploded with splashy visual effects and we received our awards, the first thing I did was bring up my menu to check the time.
4:20 a.m., which meant we'd only spent 3 minutes on the battle, but more than enough time for Cabal's group to grow curious about the absence of the boss and come wandering back. If they did, we could hide with Kismo Camouflage Cape again, but it would be difficult to stay concealed after monstrous sounds of spider explosions. I closed my window and turned into my high-fiving partners and put a finger to my lips. Fortunately, the dark elf were familiar with the sign of be quiet, and so Kismil and Asuna lowered their hands. Next, I gestured to wait and tiptoed over the room's entrance. With my back pressed to the wall, I trained my ears on the hallway, but I didn't hear any approaching voices or footsteps for now. If it was after 4 in the morning, when the hell did we leave the town? Perhaps they'd been up all night working on the guild quest. I spent 3 seconds half annoyed and half impressed by the Liberation Squad, but they didn't seem to be coming. They'd probably drawn notice from some regular spiders near the cave entrance and got stuck in a battle. I heaved a sigh of relief and returned to Asen and Kismel. It doesn't look like Cabal's group noticed us. They'll probably head back to the 2nd level to finish their guild quest, so we can slip out once they're past us, I suggested. Austin agreed, but looked puzzled. How many minutes does it take for that boss spider to come back? I started to search through my memory for that information from the beta, but Kismel answered first. That size, it'll take 3 hours to the minimum for the cave to generate enough spiritual power to give life to a new ruler. So Kismel had her own interpretation for the phenomena of mobs respawning. I was tempted to ask how this spiritual energy was different from magic that they had lost in Aincrad, but this was not the time. Anasida's turn to head me off. With that much leeway, Cabal's team will have plenty of time to search the 2nd level safely. So we ended up helping them without realizing. That kind of irks me.
As they say, the forest sees all good deeds and the insects as all bad. The holy tree will ensure you are blessed. Ah, I see. In human lands we say, one good turn deserves another. While they chatted, my brain busied itself with practical matters. It would be a pain to have to leave and deliver the emblem to the commander, only to be told to return to fight the boss spider again. But soon, I noticed that something dark was gleaming on the ground nearby. It was a gigantic fang that had come off the Queen Nephilia's mouth. I tapped it, and to be sure, a label appeared, reading Queen Spider's Poison Fang. If everything went properly, we could give the commander the Lost Scout's insignia, receive the quest to kill the spider, then show the fang to complete it immediately. I eagerly stashed the fang in my inventory and checked the clock to find that it was past 4:30. Cabal's team would be back in the 2nd level of the cave by now. Well, let's head back to the base camp, I suggested. Kismil and Asuna both turned and nodded to me at the same time. They looked totally unalike, especially with Kismil's dark skin and pointed ears.
But despite one being human and the other an NPC, I couldn't shake the sensation that they were like sisters. My hopes were rewarded when we made it back to the surface without running into Cabal. We rushed through the forest to the camp south of us, avoiding the battle where possible. By the time many rippling flags appeared through this thick fog, there were a faint purple glow in the light coming out of the exterior edge of Eincrad. That spoke of the eventual morning. The pre-dawn chill of mid-December in a real world would require a sweater and a down jacket. But after the heat of our fierce battle, it felt good on the skin. Of course, any heat or cold coming through the nerve gear was just a mental signal. We passed through the thick, magical mist created by the forest sinking charms and into the narrow rock passage to the camp. Only then could we have sigh of relief undo some of the heavy equipment. Kismel, who had no in-game item storage, remarked with envy in our misty scribing charms, as she called them and looked to the rear of the camp. Kirito, Asuna, will you deliver the memento you discovered in the cave? Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. The scout who died was the commander's blood. I do not wish to intrude upon your report. Forgive my selfishness. I didn't need to ask if she was being reminded about the death of her sister till now. Asuna reached out and brushed the dark elf's arm to soothe her. We understand. Don't worry. We'll give the report. What are you going to do next, Kismel? I will rest in the tent. Call upon me if you should need my services. And, with a weak smile, Kismel stepped away. With the forlorn chime, 1 HP bar in the upper left disappeared. A small system message accompanied to the change, alerting us to the departure of a member from the party. With a clanking salute, Kismel left and proceeded back to the right corner of the camp. I glanced over to my partner, as I expected, saw a mixture of loneliness and unease in Asuna's face. Don't worry, she'll join us again, anytime we ask, I think, I reassured her. But rather than turning on me in anger, Asuna simply said, yeah. She pulled the hanging hood over her head as though shifting gears and remarked, come on, let's go report on our quest. The commander of the Dark Elven Advance Forces took the leaf design emblem with a sign of emotion. It seemed that all the NPCs here, only Kismel, was anywhere near advanced as she was. But after spending so much time with her, I couldn't help but imagine there was a deep sadness behind the commander's stoic face. The new quest log scrolled by once I had delivered an item informing me of the new task to defeat the spider commanding nest. I hesitantly produced the spider's fang and set it down on the table. Fortunately, that fulfilled the requirements. So we were able to complete the second floor chamber of the campaign quest without leaving on another journey. Still, within 10 chambers, just in the third floor alone, there is plenty left to do. We gratefully received our coal experience and item. Both Asuna and I chose Magic Belt Pouch that had far greater capacity than it appeared suggested, initiated the third chapter of the quest, and left the commander's tent. The night had fully broken by now, and there were more dark elves milling about the camp, but Kismel was not one of them. I stopped just outside the entrance to the large commander's tent, and returned to the remaining party member. What next? We can call upon Kismel to join us at any time. Asuna looked down in thought, and then shook her head. Let's do that a bit later. I know this sounds weird, but I think we should give her some time to herself. I see. And no, that's not weird. I mean, yes, she's an NPC, but more than that, she's our partner. I don't recall ever turning into your partner. Yes, ma'am. A tantalizing smell came wafting over the dining tent. I started to wander off that direction, but also pulled my sleeve back. We have something to do before eating. Huh? What's that? Come on. Have you forgotten overnight? We were supposed to have the blacksmith forge me a new sword once we collected the right materials. The equipment in Sword Art Online could be gained in one of three ways. First was the kind looted from monsters, whether simple mobs or bosses, known as monster drops. When combined with the chest drops found in dungeon, this category was dropped loot. Next were the quest rewards, earned from completing a quest. The last category was shop made, crafted by a player or an NPC blacksmith, or leatherwork from the special ingredients or materials and items. In 5 weeks since the game had began, none of the three categories had proven themselves to be inherently better or worse than the others. My Neoblade plus 6 was a quest reward from a first floor. Asana's Windflare at plus 5 was originally a monster dropped, but it was likely that a player's population level rose. The value of quest rewards and NPCs' crafted weapons would fall, meaning the best weapons would either be rare drops or player crafted. But that eventually could be months and months away, or years, though I prayed it didn't come to that. I trudged along, lost in thought, behind Asana, her hooded cape flapping in the breeze. Despite the 7 hours of sleep I'd gotten in the last night, after a heavy questing in the dark, the advent of the morning sun brought a fresh wave of fatigue down on me. By contrast, the fencer's stride was crisp and spry. So either she was the rarest types of among MMO gamers, a morning person, or she was trying to keep her unease away with the heel of her boot. "Don't worry, it'll go fine," I mumbled as I rubbed my eyes, barely aware that I'd said it. A few feet ahead, the boots clicked to a halt, barely stopped myself in time before colliding with her back. A voice made of 70% anger and 30% of something else hit my ears. "I'm not worried about anything at all." Even in the low-functioning brain state, I was aware that I shouldn't cross her in the right then, so I answered with a simple, "Okay." "Anyway, you'd better have saved up enough materials in battle. I don't want to have to go and farm more because we're a bit short," she said,
turning back to me. When she spoke next, her voice was softer than before. "It can't always be like this." "Huh? Like what?" "I mean, I can't keep asking you what kind of materials to make a weapon, or how to beat a certain kind of monster. I have to learn and figure that stuff out for myself." But when I met you in the second floor city, you knew exactly which monsters dropped which upgrade materials," I replied. Our reunion 1 week ago seemed like an ancient history now. Asana grinned wryly beneath her deep hood. "Only because I memorized the details that were important to me from Argo's strategy guide. I don't know anything that isn't written down in a textbook. It's the same as before I came here." This caught me by surprise. I searched for the right answer, but could only shake my head. "It's the same for me too. I still have my beta knowledge to go on, but once that runs out, I'm just lost." "You're wrong. The knowledge gained from a book and the knowledge gained from experience are totally different things. The reason I'm so nervous about creating a single weapon is because I've never experienced it before." I noticed my sleepiness had worn off by then, choosing not to point out that she admitted she was worried. Kept my face straight. "Then you can experience things starting now. The most important thing is to survive and keep moving forward. That's all. Use anything you can, as long as it's for that purpose, whether it comes from Argo's book or my brain. Each and every day will bring you more experience. It's not the kind that comes in points." I felt a bit self-conscious after that serious, uncharacteristic speech, and looked away at the big tent. The first rays of sun pouring in directly from the outer aperture caught the bottom of the floor above and dyeing it red. "Good point. It's the start of another day," she murmured, and some strain had left in her voice, to my relief. I glanced back at her and added, "Also, there's one thing I forgot to say." "Huh?" Unlike with weapon upgrading, there's basically no fail state for crafting, so there's no reason to worry about. She cut me off with a punch in my gut, soft enough to cause damage, and then growled threatening. You could have mentioned that earlier! Asuna stomped off angrily enough to break through the hard ground, and I followed a carefully distance until we came back to the crafting section of the Dark Elf camp. There were 4 tents laid out along the path, each waving its own identifying flag: item shop, seamstress, leatherwork, and blacksmith. The tents displayed their rarest wares up front, and my heart soared at some of the items that were unavailable in human territory. But the pricing was rough on the wallet, especially since I'd only just reached the 3rd floor. I walked past the shops with considerable restraint and stopped in front of the blacksmith. NPC blacksmiths were bearded, macho guys from the general rule. But in keeping with the elven theme, this one was a tall and slender man with a long tied back behind his head. The only visual identifiers that marked him as a blacksmith were the thick black leather apron and elbow-length gloves. But as excellent smith hammered at his hand suggested, his following crafting skill was much higher than those found in the main town of the 3rd floor. Now that Neza of the Legend Braves had converted to Chakram Warrior, this elf was the best crafter anyone could hope to visit at this point in the game. If there was one problem here, Asa and I stopped before the tent. The dark elf blacksmith turned his sharp, tanned face upon us, snorted, and returned to his work. I felt a sudden surge of negative energy from beside me, so I pulled the cape sleeve away. This entire camp was outside the safe zone, so if we did anything criminal, the guards would swarm onto us, beat us to a pulp, and toss us out of the camp, if the tough-looking blacksmith didn't take care of us first. Fortunately, Asuna chose not to comment on the proprietorship of lack of hospitality, throwing a glare at me instead. Are you sure this is going to work? She muttered. I nodded vigorously, and there were no guarantees when it came to upgrading, but I'd say just a minute earlier, absolute failure was impossible when forging a brand new blade. Assuming that the crafter had a requisite skill proficiency necessary to create the item, of course. I let go of the cape, and Asuna took a step forward. She politely asked the elven blacksmith, "Excuse me, can I ask you to forge me a new weapon?" He replied with another snort, but the special shop menu appeared for Asuna when appearing with players, and the negotiating was usually face-to-face. But sometimes NPCs might understand the meaning of a player's language, so a menu was provided to facilitate the transaction, provided if the elf blacksmith also considered this window a type of magical charm. Asuna hit the visibility button in the corner of the window so I could see. She was about to push the create weapon button with the slender figure, but stopped. "Oh yeah, there's something I need to do first," she murmured, a moment later, realizing what she meant. "It's not a necessary step, though. You can do it as you see fit, Asuna." "I know, but I've made up my mind," she announced, and turned away from the shop window to remove the Wind Floret +5 in a familiar green sheath from her waist. From the battle against the first boss to the trials of the 2nd floor, now here in the 3rd floor, the simple but beautifully designed weapon had served Asuna well. She whispered something to the sword that I couldn't hear, then offered it to the elf blacksmith. She chose to bypass the menu system to make the system request herself. "Please convert this sword into ingots." I expected the elven blacksmith to respond with a third resounding nort, but instead he simply held out his hand. He couldn't possibly understand Asuna's attachment to the weapon, but he did silently take the Wind Floret and removed it from its scabbard. The brilliant, mirror-like polish when it was the new has faded, but the blade had taken on a deep luster since the blacksmith inspected the rapier, nodded, and tenderly placed it on the forge behind him. This was an honest, square brick forge, not the portable kind that Neza carried around. It didn't have the bellows to power up the fire, but the flames rising from the surface were mysteriously blue-green. Likely the work of more elvish magic, the fire soon turned to a silver bright red, and it began to glow from tip to the hilt. Asuna clutched her hands over her chest as she watched. Eventually, the sword flashed even brighter, then dulled, turning into a rectangular block about 8 inches long. When the light had fully subsided, the elf reached over with a gloved hand and picked the block out of the fire, handing it to Asuna. It was a single ingot, gleaming silver in the light of the morning sun. There were countless types of metal ingots in the Aincrad for the real materials like iron, and copper, fantastical ones like mithril. Even I couldn't identify all of them by sight alone. However, it was clear that Asuna's beloved weapon had turned into a particularly rare and valuable material. "Thank you very much," she said to the elf, taking the silver hunk in both hands. Asuna held it there for a few moments as though assessing its weight, and then opened her menu, placed it in her inventory. She closed the window, then slid the still open shop menu over to the resume her order. She hit the create weapon button, then hit one-handed weapon, then rapier, then select material. A smaller window popped up, showing all of the eligible materials she possessed, split into categories. When upgrading weapons, the only requirements were based on the materials, opting additional additives. But crafting a new one required a core material, the ingot. We could forge an ingot from the ores we collected from the spider cave, but those would be basic materials in this case. Asuna didn't need any of my help with this one. She selected a number of materials, leaving for the last the core, her wind fleuret, which was officially called Argentinum ingot. Once all the required items were fulfilled, a final yes, no dialogue box appeared along with the cost of creation. Asuna gave the blacksmith another glance, thanked him for the work he was about to do, and hit the yes button. With a sword swooshing sound, 2 leather sacks of brand new ingot appeared on the work platform next to the blacksmith. He silently picked up the 2 sacks, which were filled with the base, and added materials and tossed them into the forge. The sacks burned away, leaving only the materials within, gleaming red. "I don't know about this. He was awfully blunt about doing that," I muttered to Asuna, who sighed in annoyance. "You're the one who just said you couldn't fail at forging weapon. We just have to trust the process now." She learned a lot about mental toughness since we asked Neza to power up that wind fleuret in the 2nd floor. I thought. The truth was, I hadn't told Asuna about the one thing. It's impossible to fail entirely at weapon creation, meaning that all the materials disappear and no sword appeared in return. But that didn't mean the results were always fixed. The players choose a type of weapon, but what it looked like and what it was called were mystery until the process was finished. Essentially, there was a wide range of potential stats for the completed weapon, but it was impossible for the finished weapon to be weaker than the wind fleuret that it was based on. I hoped. The elven blacksmith might be unfriendly, but his skill was good. We gave him the maximum basic and added materials, and all of Asuna's sentiment was poured into that ingot. Superstition or not, I believe that even in this world, digital data, that stuff made a difference. As I pondered over the momentary thought, the materials in the fire melted together, turning into flames to a bright white color. The blacksmith tossed the ingot in, and the cold metal block began to sparkle. "Buff, please," came Asuna's voice. I felt the index and middle finger of the ring fingers in my right hand, gripped by soft palm up to the 2nd knuckle. Of course, we had no active buff effects, and even if we did, the benefits would not transfer through hand-to-hand contact. But instead of mentioning these things aloud, I simply brushed my thumb against the back of her hand, praying for a good sword to emerge. The elf paid no mind to our rapt attention. When the ingot was sufficiently heated, he picked up with gloved left hand and moved it to the anvil, smith's hammer spinning in his hand. The elf struck the metal rhythmically, once every 2 seconds. The clear ringing echoed through the morning air of the camp. The number of strikes to finish the weapon was directly related to the strength of the finished product. A starter weapon, like a plain rapier or a small sword, would only take 5 swings, less than an upgrade attempt.
The Windfloret and others of its level required around 20 blows. Therefore, counting up the number of hits as the process continued was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. 10, 15, the strikes continued. Once the number had passed 20, I slowly let out my breath I'd been holding in. This essentially ensured that the sword would be better than the Windfloret. But once the hammer could count to 25, I felt the tension return. I stared closely at the sparkle-laden ingot, unaware that it was clenching Asana's back. My anneal blade was a quest reward, but that weapon was similar quality and was worth about 30 strikes. The blacksmith's hammer was breezed past that number, then 35, only stopping after the 40th hit. The shining white ingot slowly morphed into a new form. Thin, long, sharp, beautiful. With one flash, there was a gleaming silver rapier lying atop the anvil. As we watched in silence, the blacksmith grabbed it by the ornately decorated hilt and lifted it up. He ran a finger along the slender blade, and to our surprise, he commented on his work. "A good sword." He reached back to the rack, stuffed with countless sheaths, and pulled out a bright gray one, slid the rapier into it, and handed it to Asuna. At this point, I realized I was still gripping her hand tight. I hastily let go and shoved my hands in my pockets. She looked at me with a very strange look on her face, then accepted the rapier from the elf and bowed. "Thank you very much." This time, he did a snort back. Asuna grinned and started to hook her new sword to the fastener on her belt, but I grabbed her arm. She looked in surprise, but I followed as I pulled her away to an open area within the crafting quarter. Once I stopped, she tugged her arm out of my grasp and frowned. "What's the big deal? I got the new sword. It's safe and sound." "I don't mean to complain about it, but can I just see it real quick?" I asked, holding out my hand. She pouted, but handed over her brand new weapon. The instant its dense weight hit my palm, I understood this was no ordinary weapon. I tapped the sword to bring up its properties, and we examined the results together. At the top was the sword's name, Chivalric Rapier. That was meant it's a knight's rapier, I supposed. Its current upgrade level was, of course, +0. Next to it was the number of upgrades attempts remaining. 15. What? An inexplicable grunt escaped my lips. On the outward sign of emotion, but on the inside, I was screaming. How? My shock was so great that it felt like I could shoot upward and slam my head against the bottom of the next floor up, then fall back to the ground. I didn't even need to look at the fine detail of the attack and speed numbers listed below. 15 upgrade attempts was about twice my nail blade, which had 8. In the most simple terms, Chivalric Rapier was twice as strong as my weapon. This was the equivalent of a 5th or 6th floor weapon. It was the cause for celebration without a doubt. The weapon stats had directly correlated to the chances of victory, and in fact, rate of victory meant nothing here. In other words, where any defeat spelled certain doom, every battle must be won. There was no such thing as too much power. Unfortunately, this wasn't that simple. We weren't locked in a standalone RPG, but a VR MMO RPG. Looking at our beautiful weapon with a hilt pommel, and even the battle because I was tilted of it. The fact that they'd survived long enough was a source of the strength and relief. "That's right," I said, staring at my hand. Asuna responded, her voice free of the unusual thorns and perhaps even kindly. "You have to learn to take care of yourself. When things are hard or sad, the importance to tell someone rather than holding it all in." Yeah. I looked up and saw a gentle smile on her face. "And what will happen if I tell you?" Without hesitation, she replied, "I will always be ready to treat you with a piping hot Taran-steamed bun." You don't say. I almost let my shoulders slump after that answer, and then reminded myself not to hope for anything. Plus, those steamed buns are pretty good. As long as you let them cool,
down first. Well, if I ever fail an upgrade attempt, I'll call upon you for a chat session. So anyways, back to the matter at hand, I said, hoping to change the topic. Asuna's ultra-rare smile had melted away like a flower on ice in the hot sun. Huh? Wasn't the matter at hand my wind florette still lives on? That's right, I noted, pointing Asuna's new partner. Not to repeat myself, but the chivalric rapier is unbelievably powerful for the third floor. With a bit of upgrading, a single hit from it will easily eclipse the strength of my anneal blade +6. That's a great thing, no doubt. But the question will be, how did you get such a powerful weapon? She paused to think, then turned back to look at the blacksmith's tent. A number of yards away at the other side of the hasty fence that surrounded this cramped place. I followed her gaze. The blacksmith himself was invisible from here, but his lazy clanging reached my ears. If you overlook his rudeness, that blacksmith was good at his job, wasn't he? He wouldn't every weapon he crafts be this good? If you overlook his rudeness? Well, I doubt that's the case. We've had several fights now from the third floor, and the mobs aren't really any different from what I fought in the beta. If all of a sudden you're getting a weapon that's twice as powerful as it should be, the game balance is totally broken. So you're saying that maybe the blacksmith and the main town are the same, but this dark elf was updated to make better weapons if you overlooked his rudeness? I took my eyes off the tent and scanned the entire camp. The night had completely worn off now. The deep valley was full of morning light. Beyond the last tendrils of morning mists, the guard, knights, and officers traded easy greetings in the exact scent of baking bread, wafted from the dining tent. It was exactly as I remembered from the beta. Anyone can reach this camp as long as they take on the Jade Key quest. In that sense, I don't think there's much difference between this place and the main town. Well, you're not painting a very convincing picture. And besides, who cares if the game balance is destroyed because I got a way more powerful weapon than I should have? Better than that than the reverse case. Yeah, that's true. Her opinion was absolutely correct. We weren't here to be gentlemen, to play nicely by the game's rules. We'd use any bugs or cheats possible to get out. But therein was the problem. If this chivalric rapier was indeed an irregularity of the system, an item that should not exist, there was always the danger that management, if there was even a GM other than the Kayaba, would take action to deal with it, such as replacing it with a proper weapon or deleting it entirely. But perhaps that wasn't the only issue. When we were eventually met up with the other frontline players to tackle the third floor labyrinth boss, the others would undoubtedly be stunned by Asuna's new weapon. There was no guarantee it would be all admiration. Let's do a test then. Huh? I looked perplexed, not following her line of thinking. Let's ask him to create another sword and see if he repeats the phenomenon. Ah, I see. Wait. I nodded a few times, then pointed to myself. When you say create another sword, you mean me. Why would I need to forge two swords? I can't fight with one in each hand. Well, sure, but... Without thinking, I reached my hand over my shoulder to grab the hilt of my sword. Then I realized I'd put it back in my inventory. I put the hand on my head instead and rubbed my hair. She was proposing that we test the dark elf blacksmith if we overlooked his rudeness to see if he would create a similarly overpowered sword. But that would require creating the same conditions as Asuna's purchase. Not only would I need to provide a high quality base and additional materials, but I'd also need a core ingot made from a powered up, well used weapon of my own. Meaning the anneal blade +6 I'd been fighting with for over a month. In truth, it was nearing the end of its usefulness. As the main weapon, if I managed to use both remaining upgrade attempts successfully, I'd get it to +8. It might last me until the 4th floor, but even here on the 3rd floor, there were weapons better than this at +0. Some of which were sold right from the NPC vendors that didn't come cheap. Ultimately, the anneal blade was a quest reward weapon that anyone could earn for themselves. It wasn't on the level of rare weapon with only a few copies in existence.
And yet, there was a part of me that loved that sword and wanted to keep using it until the very end of its life. It wasn't the specs and appearance or handling the weapon, it was the feeling of accomplishment that came with it. When I went straight from the town of beginnings to start the quest for this blade, using nothing more than my starter sword, it was the feeling I got when I felt the weight of the new blade, which was nothing like my first sword. Part of the reason I stuck with the one-handed sword skill from the beta was knowing that I could get myself an anneal blade first thing. But on the other hand, everything surrounding us had changed since the beta. We had to compete each floor as quickly as possible under the pressure of knowing that we only had one life to lose. The biggest priorities were efficiency and common sense, and personal attachment to items that needed to be replaced was a total waste of time. Even I said this very thing to Asen on the second floor. If we wanted to survive, we had to constantly get new gear. That was MMO RPGs. Looks like this is where we're going to our separate ways, partner. I told the sword in my item storage. It was true that only ought to test the Dark Elf Black Magic skill level. And it was true that my Neil Blade would soon be useless. The timing was telling. I gritted my teeth and prepared to acquiescence. But before I could say anything, Asen sighed and admitted, "Of course, if you're not up for it, we should call the idea off." Huh? Doesn't it seem like it would be bleed over from the into result? Like, if you didn't want to make a weapon, the finished product might be bad. What? Hey. I mean, it wasn't sure at first either, but when it came time to make the deal, I was ready. But it's clear from your look on your face that you want to go as far as you can with what you've got now. Huh? Let's think of it a better way to test this. Plus, I guess just doing one more experience isn't really proof of anything. If you're going to take the process seriously, you'll need the best materials enough to make hundreds of swords, and watch at the best rate to make extremely powerful swords. I'm sure the results would be all over the place, though. Asuna stopped for a moment, lost in thought, then turned to look back at the blacksmith's tent. Then again, maybe we shouldn't do that to the blacksmith. To the camp as a whole. I mean, he's doing his best at his duty for the sake of other soldiers. If we barged in, forcing him to make hundreds of swords we're not even going to use, it would probably just be an insult to his profession. I don't know. Maybe I'm just being weird. She lowered her head, embarrassed, and looked up at me with her hazel eyes. I grasped the right of the sword, and even truly came up with, okay, I won't do it. Like it's a dumb younger brother following his smart older sister's lead. I didn't want to be the entirety of my response, so I kicked my brain into high speed and added, "But we still have business with the blacksmith. We'll want to get your new rapier up to +5, and I need to power mine up a bit if I'm going to keep using it." But as usual, Big Sister had a smarter answer. "I'm fine with upgrading it, but won't we be short in materials?" Ignoring my rapier for a second, "Your Neil Blade is +6 already, and has 8 max attempts, right? We'll want to use the maximum number of materials to get our chances of success to top value." Why are you making that weird face? I'm just thinking, you've really grown as a player. Perhaps it's not true that you only have bookmarks without experience. I thought I was just putting on my honest feelings into words, but she gave me an equally weird look in return, then let out a snort. "Oh, forget about me for a moment. What's the plan? Going out for more materials?" "Actually, that won't be necessary." I grinned, opened my window, scrolling through the item list until I found what I wanted. What materialized was perfectly ordinary black leather bag with a single brand on the side. Asuna grimaced when she saw it. "Isn't that the mark of the cowmen from the second floor? It better not be filled with something weird." Sadly, it's not. I closed my window and grabbed something out of the sack. It was gleaming black metal plate, about 1 by 4 inches. The same cattle mark was stamped onto the surface. "Oh, that's just a metal plank. I don't recognize the color, though." "It's not iron or steel," Asuna said. She was correct. Metal planks were materials smelted from ores, collected mostly naturally dungeons, but they could be used for upgrading and crafting combined to larger, full-sized ingots. But while this was a plank, it wasn't just any plank. I grinned devilishly and explained the cattle sign. This was the last attack reward for Colonel NATO in the second floor boss battle. This one plank will boost the upgrade success rate of any weapon below +10 to max. Plus, it allows you to choose whichever stat you want to boost. I could see Asana's response coming from a mile away. You should have said that even earlier. The talented, if you overlook its rudeness, blacksmith greeted us with his usual snort when we returned. When we made 7 attempts of maximizing of the 95% success, all 7 were good. Asana's chivalric rapier was now +5. My anneal blade went from +6 to +8. There were still 10 more of the cow-branded planks in the leather sack, but I decided to save them for a rainy day. With the bag back in my inventory, I drew my freshly upgraded weapon, now with 4 points to sharpness and durability to each. There was a fresh, deep shine to the thick blade that gave it prickly intensity. At this point, it might last in the end stages of the 4th floor, but not just the 3rd. Satisfied, I snapped the sword back into its scabbard, then headed back to the same sound for the next to me. We glanced at each other and grinned confidently. No true swordsman could resist the excitement of a good upgrade. Her rapier back to her left hip, Asana cleared her throat and said, I'm going to pay you back for the 5 planks, just so you know. Well, I only burnt Colonel NATO because of your help, so you won't need to bother. Either of us could have gotten the last attack. Really? Then I'll give it to you in your next rare drop I get. She lowered the volume of her voice, whispered in my ears only.
But there were a way to determine if it's a bug of her system or not? Yeah, I know.
I replaced on my back and crossed my arms. The plan was to attempt a mass order was shot down, and we certainly couldn't ask him ourselves. No. Hey, that's it, snapping my fingers. We can just ask someone who knows plenty about this camp. The valley that housed the Dark Elf base was mostly round, the amenities such as dining and businesses on the eastern side, and the barracks of the storage of the western side, with a main path through the center. It had the size and detail of a small village on its own. It seemed strange that it would be instanced for every individual party on the quest given its scope. Austin and I left the business area, crossing the main street for the barracks section, and stopping in the front of the tent at the south end. I lifted the familiar black pelt door and called inside. Hello, it's Kirito. May we come in? A voice immediately responded. Certainly. I was just about to finish preparing breakfast. We entered the tent, excusing ourselves first. My heart was initially set at ease by the gentle, milky scent that went into spams. When I saw the elf knight rising from their cushions, the 5 seconds that I witnessed Kismel's black bodysuit last night were stunning enough, and this morning she was wearing nothing over her brown skin but a sheer gown that was significantly open at the front. SAO's age rating was only 12 and up, right? Or maybe after it turned into a game of death, the usual standards stopped applying. I felt a kind pressure emanating from my right and took my eyes off the elf's skin as naturally as I could. I hate to bother you during your meal, but we wanted to talk about something. If you have a new mission, I will gladly accompany you. That's great, but we're not leaving yet. I just want some information first. Ah, in that case, we can talk as we eat. Have a seat. I will fix your portions. She gestured to the soft, fluffy furs on the ground and turned back to the stove at the center of the tent. I felt like if we were going to be polite and told her not to mind us, she would take it literally. So I thanked her instead. Asuna pulled her hood back and said, We'll happily eat, showing just as much interest in the smell coming from the pot. We sat down on the furs and watched Kismel take the lid off the pot and stir its contents. Asuna hissed into my ear. Don't stare too long. You'll trip the harassment code. Huh? I thought it was only for physical contact. I replied, then cursed, and I realized I should have denied looking at her at all. The harassment code was a part of the game's system that activated when certain improper activities was continued against an NPC or player for a set amount of time. Similar to the anti-crime code, the first offense was accompanied by a warning, physical pressure away from the target, but repeat offenders would eventually wind up teleporting beneath the Black Iron Palace in the Town of Beginnings. For a time, some of the frontline players tried to see if we could use it reliably as an escape mechanism in the midst of danger. After all, the way to instantly teleport in the fields of dungeon was extremely rare and valuable crystal, and those weren't even available in the lower floors. But the research ended in absolute failure. Argo, the rat, had noted in the information she had sold to me. Not only did the automatic teleportation to the Black Prison involve an unpleasant force like electrical shock, shocking the player back, which I'd never felt, but I had initiated several times and other players had to be one of the opposite sex. It was easier to simply run away from the battle than spend a bunch of time fondling each other. Of course, SEO's ratio to men to women was frighteningly skewed. The phenomenon would work against an NPC too, but few item-selling ladies bothered hanging out in deep dungeon caves. On top of that, it wasn't easy to get out of the prison once teleported there, and some said that you drop items during the teleportation. Thus, the dream conveniently using the anti-harassment code to escape danger was crushed. It was simple curiosity that led me to buy this intel from Argo, not any intention of turning into a talented harassment artist, but at any rate, a simple stare would not set off the code. Yet, the whispering from Asuna did not stop. Uh-oh, here it goes. 5 seconds. 4, 3... Huh? What? I panicked and looked back and forth between Kismel's legs as they peeked out from the hem of her gown, and the steam hissing in the pot. The countdown continued. 2, 1, activated. Thud. Asuna caved into my right side with a solid punch. I rolled over in pain, wondering why that didn't set off the actual code. Kismel turned back and Asuna smiled. You two get along so well. The dark elf knighted treated us to a dish with some starchy crop between rice and wheat, boiled in milk and seasoned with nuts and dried fruit. It was firmly Western in style, but at least the Eincradian, and yet something about its delightful taste was oddly familiar. The only problem was that too small. We treasured the small plates and the stuff with the wooden spoons she offered. This is really good, Asuna said wistfully. I never thought I'd get to eat oatmeal in this game. Wait, this is oatmeal? I asked. I'd only ever heard of the name before. Asuna nodded. Yes, the texture's a bit different, but the flavor is spot on. Oh, I said, impressed. Kismel chimed in. Ah, so you eat milk porridge in your human towns as well. I didn't know that. Perhaps someday. She trailed off. Both of us looked at her, but the expression was hard to read. Kismel shoveled down the last of her porridge or oatmeal, or whatever it was, and returned to our gaze. Kirito, Asuna, you said you wanted to talk about something. Oh, yeah, that's right. Well, I wasn't sure how to approach the topic, so I decided to simply straight up and ask her opinion on the blacksmith's skill. Kismel's reaction was something between praise and unease. Simply put, he was talented but fickle, sometimes creating masterworks, but often outright refusing pushy, misguided orders. At that description, Asa and I looked at each other in understanding. The chivalric rapier at her waist now had to be one of those masterworks. It was not the product of a bug or error, but the proper result that only occurred a very rare frequency. That part was good news, but the bit about misguided orders worried me. After all, what could be more misguided than asking him to craft hundreds of weapons based on a rare minimum of cheap materials? If he only produced crappy weapons in response to such an order, there'd be no way to test the odds. He'd already made Asuna an overpowered weapon and succeeded in perfecting my sword. We didn't need and couldn't ask for a better set of results. But it wasn't just that simple. As a member of the frontier force of SAO, I had an obligation to spread the info I learned to inform front runners. They needed to know that the elf camp could produce weapons worthy of the 6th floor, as well as the possibility that could keep the elf knights alive in the Jade Key quest. I suddenly realized that I was too lost in thought. My spoon was scraping empty air on my plate, then cursed myself for not savoring the taste more. "Thanks for the meal, Kismel," I said. "The porridge was good, and you told us what we needed to know." Asuna bowed her head as well. "I thought it was delicious. Thank you for the food." "I'm glad to hear that you enjoyed it. I will make much more tomorrow morning." Kismel replied with a smile, taking our plates. "Now, what's next? We can spend more time in the camp preparing, or we can head out for our next mission." "Actually," I said, shaking my head, "Asa and I need to go return to the human town for now."